The topic this time is about the Chinese economy. First of all, I'd like you to take a look at this article. What this article is about is that the figures for January of this year have come out, specifically, how much new financing increased within China in January. According to the data, it increased by 5.13 trillion yuan. In Japanese, we usually use the term trillion yen, but in Chinese, for some reason, they write it as wan yi, which translates to 5,001,300 yuan. That's what it comes down to. So, in just 1 month, it increased by that amount. Converting 5 trillion yuan into Japanese yen, it's roughly 100 trillion yen, a massive amount. Not only that, but this figure also includes what's called shadow banking, something that's long been talked about in relation to China. The total amount of financing, including all of that, is part of what's shown in this figure, and it's recorded the highest increase ever. This suggests that since the start of this year, the demand for funds has surged significantly. So, first, I want to clarify what it means when the total amount of financing increases within a country. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's not something you can definitively say one way or the other. Let's start with the positive side. An increase in financing means people or companies are borrowing money. For companies, this could mean expanding production or investing in equipment, which can indicate economic growth. For individuals, it might mean borrowing money to spend, like using a credit card, which can also signify economic growth. During economic expansion, people might think, I can borrow now and pay it back with my next paycheck, or my salary will increase in the future, so this debt doesn't matter. In that sense, it can reflect a very positive economic situation. When the economy is booming, individuals want to borrow and spend more, and companies want to borrow to scale up production. This leads to hiring more people, which expands employment. So, an increase in total financing in a country can indicate that the country is experiencing strong economic development. However, it's not always the case. Borrowing to spend or invest in equipment only makes sense if growth continues into the future. For example, if individuals borrow to buy things or companies borrow to double their production capacity from 10,000 units a month to 20,000, and then the economy takes a downturn, things get problematic. If it gets really bad, they can't repay the loans, companies go bankrupt, individuals go broke. In China's case, personal bankruptcy isn't really a thing, so there's no escape route. People can end up as debt slaves. If financing increases too much, borrowers can't repay, lenders can't recover their money, and it triggers a financial crisis, leading to long-term economic stagnation. When that happens, people stop thinking about borrowing to spend and shift to saving as much as possible or buying cheaper things. The economy enters a phase of contraction. So, what's the situation with China's economy right now? On the downside, the economy has already started shrinking. The real estate bubble has definitely passed its peak, though it hasn't fully bottomed out yet. In some areas, properties are being sold off at rock-bottom prices, but there are no buyers because people think prices will drop further. Some even wonder if there's any future in buying property there, if the city itself might just decline. Everyone's being cautious. For instance, people buying apartments for themselves to live in, that's not for investment purposes. In China, it's customary for couples to take out a mortgage and buy a home when they get married, and that still happens. But the demand for buying property because it'll go up in value has almost completely disappeared. For companies, too, it's not the kind of environment where they're eager to invest in new production capacity. So, logically speaking, in today's China, there shouldn't be this explosive increase in total financing. Yet, why has it surged so much since the start of this year? When you look at the details, it becomes clear. The first key point is, who's borrowing this money? It's local governments. As we've mentioned on this channel before, China's local governments are financially finished. For example, civil servants are getting pay cuts or not getting paid at all. They're trying to make up the shortfall by collecting tons of fines. Or, because their local economy is collapsing, they target companies in other regions that are still functioning, sending police from afar to detain the company's executives, then negotiating a settlement where they pay the local government to be released. It's basically extortion or robbery, there's no rule of law in it. That's how far gone local governments are, scraping together money like this. Local governments also get around the rule that they can't borrow directly by creating shell companies, entities separate from the government, that take on massive debt. The government implicitly guarantees this debt, so it's effectively treated as government debt. But the interest rates on this kind of borrowing are extremely high. Now, the central government has stepped in and said, local governments can borrow directly, issue local bonds and use that money to pay off your high-interest debts first. Otherwise, the burden of interest payments will choke their finances forever and lead to collapse. So, when they say financing has increased, it's largely local governments doing the borrowing. What does this mean? They're borrowing money to repay expensive debt. It's not really a positive sign for the Chinese economy, it's just borrowing to pay off old loans. And since the amount of lending is increasing, they're borrowing even more to cover the interest. That's the reality of China's local governments. The huge increase in total financing this year doesn't mean the economy is recovering or turning around, it's something to be cautious about. By the way, going back to the lending figures, there's another part called Shihui Rongxi in Chinese, which refers to shadow banking. This includes money raised through investment trusts or funds and then lent out. It's technically called investment rather than financing, but what's the function? Banks take deposits from lots of people and aren't allowed to lend to overly risky places due to regulations. Shadow banking is the workaround. Money gets funneled to places banks can't touch, under the guise of investment. That's increasing too. So, what are these borrowers doing with the money? It's the same as the local governments, covering old debts. China has tons of zombie companies that can't function without borrowing. This has been talked about even in Japan, where Chinese info is scarce, for years. These companies borrow, then borrow again to cover the interest and repay the loans, so their debt just keeps ballooning. Not only that, but for unprofitable companies, they've got employee salaries, fixed costs, and various expenses. If they can't generate revenue, those costs add to the debt too. Recently, I mentioned that China has a ton of state-owned enterprises. Given it's a communist country where everything was originally state-owned, it's not surprising there are tens of thousands of them. Not all of these, tied to Communist Party interests, are profitable. Many are zombie companies, borrowing to repay loans. In a normal country, an increase in financing would signal active economic activity, but in China, it's more like the whole country is turning into a zombie. The article might make it sound like there's significant corporate demand for funds, but what matters is what they're using the money for. In China's current environment, it's not about investing in new equipment. Competition within the country has gotten so fierce that making a profit is incredibly tough. Companies are slashing prices to the limit, waiting for rivals to go bankrupt. That's their strategy. In that situation, further equipment investment is out of the question. It's largely borrowing to repay debt. Now, let's look at ordinary citizens. The article says the funding demand from Chinese individuals is relatively weak. As I mentioned earlier, though, there's a cultural norm in China where married couples buy a home. So, there's some demand for that. Medium and long-term loans, mainly mortgages, have increased by about 493.51 billion yuan compared to last year. That's likely because property prices have been dropping, making it easier to buy. Lower prices might be spurring sales. However, the increase is smaller than the year before that, meaning the growth in this hard demand for homes is slowing down. Overall individual funding demand has weakened significantly, down by 980.1 billion yuan from last year, or roughly 20 trillion yen. This means Chinese people aren't borrowing to buy things, aside from homes, they're not in that mindset. In this environment, it's hard to believe companies alone have huge funding needs. As I said, it's borrowing to repay debt, and since the debt keeps growing, the need for funds increases every year. That's the reality. Normally, an increase in total financing suggests a robust economy, so the Communist Party's website claims the real economy started the year steadily. Some in Japan's business community are hopeful about China's economy too. If it's about selling Japanese goods to China, that's fine, but investing in China at this moment? I wouldn't. Chinese people will still buy unique Japanese products, but betting on China's economy improving now isn't the right timing. Looking only at the numbers in media reports, it's hard to tell if it's good or bad, or even trustworthy. But as someone observing Chinese society daily, I can say it's in bad shape. Hospitals suddenly halting operations, the restaurant industry, a common business for Chinese people with some savings, in tatters. Numbers alone don't tell the story. Broadly observing what's happening in society is key. By the way, this channel is preparing a video about China's restaurant industry, showing how it's tied to the worsening economy and how the Communist Party's flaws stand out in tough times. Stay tuned for that. From this article, though, it's clear that businesses targeting ordinary Chinese people will face tough times ahead. I mentioned this to someone who enjoys stock investing, and they said some sectors thrive when the economy worsens. I asked which ones, and they jokingly said, "Pay me if you want to know." So, viewers, what sectors do you think do well in a bad economy?